The Nakajima Kikka emerged during the final stages of the Second World War, a time when Japan's aviation industry faced immense pressure to produce weapons that could reverse the tide of Allied dominance. By 1944, the Empire of Japan had suffered heavy losses in the Pacific. Its once formidable carrier fleet was largely destroyed, and its air defenses were crumbling under the relentless bombing campaigns of the United States Army Air Forces. The introduction of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, capable of flying higher and faster than most Japanese interceptors could reach, underscored the urgent need for advanced technology. In this environment, Japan turned its attention to jet propulsion, hoping it might provide the same dramatic leap that the German Messerschmitt Me 262 promised in Europe. The origins of the Kikka lay in a direct response to the German example. In 1944, Japan dispatched technical missions to its Axis partner to study advanced military technology. Among the material shared was information about the Me 262 jet fighter, as well as details on rocket and jet propulsion systems. While Germany was unable to provide a complete aircraft, blueprints and technical reports were transmitted, and Japanese engineers took keen interest. For the Nakajima Aircraft Company, already one of Japan's leading manufacturers, this represented an opportunity to develop a domestic jet-powered aircraft tailored to Japan's specific needs. Unlike the Luftwaffe, which envisioned the Me 262 as a high-speed interceptor, the Imperial Japanese Navy initially conceived the Kikka as a versatile attack aircraft capable of launching from short or improvised runways, striking at Allied ships and returning quickly. The Navy's requirements called for an aircraft that could be used in both kamikaze operations and conventional missions. This dual-purpose thinking reflected Japan's strategic desperation. By late 1944, the expectation of attritional combat had given way to plans for decisive, often suicidal, strikes. The design team at Nakajima, led by engineer Iwao Shibuya and supervised by the Navy's aeronautical arsenal, began with the German Me 262 as inspiration, but deliberately diverged to meet Japan's operational conditions. The Kikka would be smaller and lighter, easier to manufacture with Japan's limited industrial resources, and designed for operation from temporary or concealed airstrips. To achieve this, the aircraft's wings were fitted with folding mechanisms, enabling it to be hidden in caves or tunnels and rapidly deployed when needed. Propulsion was the greatest challenge. The Germans had provided documentation on the BMW 003 turbojet engine, but Japan lacked the materials and industrial capacity to reproduce it exactly. Instead, engineers at Ishikawajima developed a domestic version, the NE-20 turbojet, based loosely on the BMW design but simplified for Japanese production. This engine would power the Kikka, though it offered less thrust and reliability than its German counterpart. The limitations of metallurgy, fuel quality, and wartime shortages meant that Japanese jets could never match the performance of those in Europe. Structurally, the Kikka was a straightforward design, a compact twin-engine aircraft with straight wings, tricycle landing gear, and a simple fuselage. Its armament was projected to include 30mm cannons for interception missions or bombs for ground and naval attack. The Navy also envisioned a potential suicide bomber variant equipped with rocket-assisted takeoff gear, allowing heavily loaded Kikkas to launch from short runways or even from modified warships. This adaptability reflected Japan's strategic reality, where flexibility and concealment were prioritized over long-term performance. By late 1944, the project had moved from paper to prototype construction. The Navy pushed Nakajima to accelerate development, seeing the Kikka as a possible counter to B-29 raids and as a weapon that might delay Allied advances during the expected invasion of the Japanese home islands. In reality, the project was hindered by material shortages, Allied bombing of industrial centers, and the inexperience of Japanese engineers with jet technology. Nonetheless, the mere fact that Japan could produce a functioning jet aircraft under such conditions was a remarkable achievement, a testament to ingenuity under extreme pressure. The origins of the Nakajima Kikka thus reflect both ambition and desperation. It was conceived not as a revolutionary air superiority fighter like the Me 262, but as a pragmatic, multi-role aircraft adapted to Japan's dire wartime circumstances. It represented Japan's gamble on jet propulsion, an attempt to leap ahead technologically at the very moment when the empire was collapsing. Whether it could have made a meaningful difference in combat was doubtful, but its conception remains one of the most striking episodes in the history of late-war aviation. The prototype of the Nakajima Kikka took shape in early 1945 against the backdrop of escalating American bombing raids and the imminent threat of invasion. Despite shortages of materials and disruption to production facilities, Nakajima pressed ahead, completing the first airframe with remarkable speed. The aircraft was compact, its lines reflecting a clear resemblance to the German Me-262, yet it was a simpler and more austere design. The twin NE-20 turbojet engines were mounted under the wings, the fuselage was kept narrow, and the cockpit was functional rather than refined. Every decision reflected the urgency of wartime Japan. Simplicity, speed of construction, and practicality mattered more than innovation for its own sake. Testing preparations revealed the immense challenges facing Japanese engineers. The NE-20 engines, though based on German concepts, were underpowered and fragile. They produced less thrust than planned, reducing the Kikka's projected speed and climb rate. Reliability was also a constant issue, as Japan's metallurgical limitations meant turbine blades and bearings often wore out quickly. Nevertheless, the mere fact that the engines functioned at all under such conditions was regarded as an accomplishment. On 7 August 1945, the Kikka made its first flight from Kisarazu Air Base, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Susumu Tanaoka. The aircraft used a conventional runway takeoff rather than the rocket-assisted system envisioned for heavily loaded combat missions. The test lasted only 20 minutes but demonstrated that the design was fundamentally sound. Tanaoka reported stable handling, good control responsiveness, and no major aerodynamic problems. The Kikka had proven that Japan could field a jet aircraft even if its performance fell short of expectations. The second test flight, conducted on 11 August, attempted to incorporate rocket-assisted takeoff units to simulate a fully armed launch from short fields. These auxiliary rockets, mounted under the fuselage, ignited unevenly, causing the aircraft to veer off course. Tanaoka aborted the takeoff, but the Kikka overran the runway and sustained damage when its landing gear collapsed. Though not a catastrophic loss, the accident halted flight testing just as the program was gaining momentum. With only days remaining before Japan's surrender, the prototype was never repaired, and no further flights took place. Several more airframes were under construction at the time, with plans for a small production run to begin in late 1945. These included potential variants for attack, reconnaissance, and even suicide missions. However, Allied bombing raids on industrial sites slowed progress to a crawl, and none of the additional aircraft were completed before the end of the war. The Kikka project, though promising in outline, was effectively still in its infancy when Japan capitulated. The testing era highlighted both the promise and the limitations of the Kikka. On the positive side, it demonstrated that Japan's aviation industry could adapt quickly to jet propulsion, creating a flyable aircraft in less than a year despite overwhelming obstacles. Its aerodynamic design was sound, and its adaptability, folding wings, rocket-assisted takeoff, multi-role potential, showed forward thinking. On the negative side, its engines were weak, its performance was unlikely to match Allied jets, and its operational effectiveness would have been marginal at best. The timing of the prototype's flights could not have been more symbolic. The first flight occurred just one day after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, and the second took place while Japan was reeling from the Nagasaki attack and Soviet entry into the war. Within a week, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, and the Kikka project came to an abrupt end. What might have become Japan's first operational jet fighter remained only a prototype and a handful of incomplete airframes, left behind as evidence of a technological gamble that ran out of time. In retrospect, the prototype and testing phase of the Kikka illustrates the extraordinary strain placed on Japan's engineers and the narrow margins within which they operated. They succeeded in proving the principle of jet flight, but the aircraft never advanced beyond the experimental stage. The Kikka had arrived too late to influence the war, its maiden flight serving less as the beginning of a new era for Japan, and more as a final gesture of resistance in a conflict that was already lost. The Nakajima Kikka never progressed to the stage of true operational deployment, yet plans for its entry into service were already being drawn up in the final weeks of the war. The Imperial Japanese Navy had envisioned the aircraft as part of its homeland defense strategy, preparing for the anticipated Allied invasion of the Japanese islands. With American B-29 raids devastating urban and industrial centers and carrier-based aircraft freely striking coastal targets, the Navy sought a weapon that could be dispersed, hidden, and launched quickly to inflict sudden damage on enemy forces. Production planning was modest by necessity. Unlike the German Me-262, which required dedicated facilities and resources on a large scale, the Kikka was intended to be produced in smaller workshops and dispersed factories. Its relatively simple design and folding wings made it adaptable to underground construction or assembly in concealed locations. The Navy calculated that even a limited number of Kikkas operating in hit-and-run fashion could complicate Allied air operations. The aircraft's compact size also meant that it could be deployed from hastily prepared strips or even improvised sites close to the coast. Training concepts for pilots were equally pragmatic. Veterans of propeller-driven fighters and bombers would undergo a transition program using trainers adapted to simulate jet performance characteristics. The Navy was particularly interested in the Kikka as a strike aircraft, carrying bombs against Allied warships and transports offshore. In this role, it was expected to operate with rocket-assisted takeoff, allowing it to launch with a heavy payload from very short runways. Plans even existed for kamikaze versions, stripped of landing gear, and optimized for one-way missions, reflecting Japan's increasingly desperate reliance on suicide tactics. Reactions from within the military leadership were mixed. Some officers saw the Kikka as a technological lifeline, a weapon that could restore morale and provide a symbolic counter to Allied superiority. Others, more pragmatic, recognized its limited performance and the severe constraints of production. With the NE-20 engine underpowered and prone to failure, the aircraft's speed and climb rate would not have matched the American P-80 Shooting Star or even late-model propeller fighters like the P-51 Mustang. At best, the Kikka could have been a disruptive weapon, capable of surprising attacks but not sustained air defense. Despite these limitations, preparations for squadron integration were underway by the summer of 1945. The Navy had designated Yokosuka Air Group as the first potential operational unit to receive the aircraft. Airfields near Tokyo were surveyed for suitability, and a handful of pilots began familiarization training with ground procedures and simulator exercises. In parallel, the Navy drafted plans for the construction of dozens of additional airframes, with the hope of fielding them by late 1945 or early 1946. These preparations, however, were entirely theoretical by the time Japan surrendered. None of the airframes beyond the prototype and a partially assembled second aircraft were completed, and no Kikka squadron ever achieved operational status. The reality of the Kikka's entry into service was shaped less by its design than by the strategic collapse of Japan in 1945. Even if it had been completed in larger numbers, fuel shortages, lack of trained pilots, and the overwhelming Allied superiority in the air would have severely limited its impact. The Kikka was a bold technological leap, but it was not a miracle weapon. Its place in history rests on what it represented: the attempt by Japan to enter the jet age, rather than on any operational record. Thus, the Kikka's entry into service can best be described as planned but unrealized. It existed in Navy documents, in proposals for squadrons and missions, but not in combat reality. The war ended before the aircraft could take its place alongside the Me-262 as one of the world's first operational jets. Instead, it remained a prototype with the shadow of potential roles, remembered as a symbol of Japan's last attempt to close the technological gap in the dying days of the Pacific War. Combat use of the Nakajima Kikka remained theoretical, confined to the strategic imagination of Japanese planners rather than the reality of the battlefield. No Kikka ever flew an operational sortie before Japan's surrender, yet the concepts of how it might have been employed provide valuable insight into the desperate state of Japanese strategy in 1945. The Imperial Japanese Navy envisioned the Kikka primarily as a short-range attack aircraft, intended to deliver precision strikes against Allied invasion fleets and air bases. With its compact size and provision for rocket-assisted takeoff units, the aircraft could have launched from hidden or improvised strips, striking targets, and returning before Allied air power could react. The Navy emphasized missions against transport ships and carriers, hoping that even limited numbers of Kikkas, used in sudden, concentrated attacks, might inflict serious disruption. In this way, the Kikka was never meant to compete with Allied fighters in air superiority, but to function as a tactical weapon in the defense of the home islands. Kamikaze adaptation was an explicit part of its combat role. Some plans outlined aircraft stripped of unnecessary equipment and landing gear, fitted with a single large bomb and launched on one-way missions. The combination of jet speed and explosive payload was considered especially dangerous against Allied naval vessels, which by this stage had developed effective defenses against slower piston-engine attackers. The hope was that the Kikka's speed would reduce the reaction time of anti-aircraft crews and make interception by fighters more difficult. In theory, this could have increased the effectiveness of suicide missions, though Japan's dwindling fuel supplies and shortage of trained pilots would have limited how many could be fielded. Had the Kikka reached service, its effectiveness would likely have been constrained by its engine performance. The NE-20 turbojets were underpowered, producing only about 475 kg of thrust each, which restricted payload capacity and climb rate. Allied assessments after the war concluded that the Kikka's speed would have been roughly equal to the best late-war propeller fighters, but insufficient to match true jets such as the Lockheed P-80. This meant that in combat, the Kikka could have been effective in quick-strike roles but would have struggled in sustained aerial engagements. Japanese tactical planning reflected these realities. Operational documents suggested deploying Kikka units in waves, often supported by rocket boosters to shorten takeoff runs. The first wave would focus on shipping, while subsequent waves could attack airfields or logistical targets supporting the invasion. Dispersed airstrips hidden in forests or tunnels were prepared to accommodate such tactics, though few were completed before the surrender. The aim was less to establish air superiority than to impose delay and inflict attritional losses on Allied forces as they approached the home islands. The few test flights that occurred gave only a limited sense of the aircraft's combat potential. Pilots noted stable handling and straightforward flight characteristics, which suggested that it would have been relatively easy for experienced aviators to transition to. However, with little time to refine tactics or resolve technical issues, the Kikka would have entered combat as an experimental weapon rather than a mature fighter. The risk of engine failures or takeoff accidents, especially with rocket boosters, was high, reducing its potential reliability in actual operations. Ultimately, the Kikka's combat history was one of unrealized potential. It never engaged Allied aircraft, never struck a fleet, and never flew in defense of Japanese cities. Yet it symbolized the last phase of Japan's wartime aviation, innovative on paper, improvised in execution, and undermined by the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies. If deployed, it might have caused temporary disruption, perhaps sinking or damaging isolated ships, but it could not have altered the course of the war. The Kikka remains significant not for what it accomplished in combat, but for what it represented, a glimpse of what Japan hoped jets could achieve in the final defense of the homeland, even as surrender rendered those hopes obsolete. Variance and technological evolution of the Nakajima Kikka never advanced far, but they reflect both Japan's intentions for the aircraft and the immense pressures under which it was designed. From the outset, the Imperial Japanese Navy imagined the Kikka not as a single-purpose machine, but as a flexible platform that could be adapted to multiple roles depending on operational needs. These plans were ambitious, but most remained only on paper by the time of surrender. The baseline design, the Kikka prototype, was conceived as a light attack aircraft, with provision for two 30mm cannons in the nose and a small bomb load under the fuselage or wings. This standard version formed the foundation for all further developments, with its compact fuselage, folding wings for concealment, and compatibility with rocket-assisted takeoff gear. It was intended to serve both as a conventional strike aircraft and as the basis for kamikaze adaptations. One of the most concrete proposed variants was a two-seat trainer. Recognizing the steep learning curve for pilots transitioning from piston engines to jets, Nakajima drew up plans for a stretched fuselage accommodating an instructor and student. This trainer would have been vital for building up operational units, as jet flight characteristics demanded new skills and instincts. Without such a variant, the Navy would have had to rely on improvised methods, which could have increased accidents in service. However, the trainer never progressed beyond design sketches. Another planned variant was a reconnaissance model. Engineers envisioned removing some armament to fit cameras, leveraging the Kikka's speed for photographic runs over Allied fleets or bases. In theory, such an aircraft could have offered valuable intelligence at a time when Japan's ability to monitor enemy movements was collapsing. Yet with the NE-20's limited thrust and reliability, the feasibility of carrying heavy cameras and fuel remained uncertain. The most striking proposal was a dedicated suicide bomber version. In this configuration, the Kikka would be stripped of landing gear and unnecessary equipment to save weight, carrying a large bomb for a one-way mission. Rocket-assisted takeoff packs would allow it to launch with a heavy payload from very short strips or even from catapult systems. This variant reflected the extreme desperation of Japan in 1945, when kamikaze tactics were seen as one of the few remaining options to inflict serious losses on the Allies. Though technically simpler to produce, the psychological and logistical cost of such missions was immense, and the war ended before this role was tested. Navalization was also discussed. Some proposals suggested adapting the Kikka for launch from modified carriers or surface vessels, using rockets or catapults to overcome short deck lengths. Folding wings already made the concept feasible, but Japan lacked suitable carriers by 1945, rendering this idea purely theoretical. Technological evolution of the Kikka was constrained by Japan's industrial limitations. The NE-20 turbojet itself was only barely adequate, and efforts to produce more powerful versions were still in their infancy when the war ended. Engineers considered scaling up the Kikka with larger wings and stronger engines, effectively moving it closer to the Me-262 in performance. But these ambitions outstripped what could realistically be built under constant bombardment. No foreign or licensed production was ever considered, as Japan stood alone in its late-war aviation projects. Unlike the Me-262, which influenced post-war Soviet and American jet development, the Kikka remained a uniquely Japanese project without international continuation. After the war, however, captured examples and documents were studied by the Allies. American engineers examined the unfinished prototypes and NE-20 engines, noting the resemblance to German designs but also the simplifications and compromises forced by Japan's resource shortages. In summary, the Kikka's variants existed largely as plans rather than reality. The aircraft's design showed adaptability. Trainer, reconnaissance, suicide attack, and naval versions were all envisioned. But time and resources prevented their realization. Its technological evolution was stunted by wartime collapse, ensuring that the Kikka never progressed beyond a single flying prototype and a handful of incomplete airframes. Still, the very existence of these proposed variants demonstrates how Japan sought to squeeze maximum potential from a desperate gamble on jet propulsion, even as the empire itself was on the brink of defeat. The global impact and legacy of the Nakajima Kikka were shaped less by what it accomplished and more by what it symbolized. As Japan's first jet-powered aircraft, it represented both a remarkable technical achievement under catastrophic wartime conditions and a reminder of the nation's desperate gamble in the final months of the conflict. Its legacy lies not in operational history, it never reached combat, but in the way it illustrates Japan's technological ambitions, its reliance on German inspiration, and the transitional moment between piston and jet warfare. Internationally, the Kikka is often compared to the Messerschmitt Me-262, the German jet that inspired its design. Allied intelligence during the war had tracked German advances closely, and after the war, the Me-262 became the template for jet development in both the United States and the Soviet Union. The Kikka, by contrast, had no such influence abroad. Its performance was modest, its engines underpowered, and its design incomplete when captured. American forces found only the damaged prototype and a few unfinished airframes, along with technical documents on the NE-20 turbojet. While these were examined, they offered little that U.S. engineers had not already acquired from studying German technology directly. In this sense, the Kikka had no significant global impact on post-war aircraft design. Its symbolic role within Japan, however, was more profound. For Japanese engineers, the Kikka demonstrated that the nation could produce a working jet, despite crippling shortages of materials, constant bombing raids, and the collapse of industrial infrastructure. Although it never saw combat, its successful test flights provided a measure of validation for Japan's aviation industry. After the war, many of the engineers who had worked on the Kikka carried their experience into Japan's civilian aerospace sector, which re-emerged in the 1950s under strict Allied oversight. The project thus preserved technical expertise that might otherwise have been lost in the transition from military to civilian aviation. In cultural memory, the Kikka has come to symbolize both ambition and futility. It was conceived as a weapon that might delay or complicate an Allied invasion, but by the time it first flew, Japan had already suffered irreparable defeats. The timing of its maiden flight, just one day after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, underscored how disconnected the project was from the reality of the war's end. For many historians, the Kikka represents Japan's attempt to leap into a technological future even as its empire collapsed around it. Physically, the Kikka's legacy is minimal. No complete airframes survive, though fragments and components were preserved and studied in the United States after the war. Today, only partial reconstructions and replicas exist in museums, such as at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum and the Gifu Kakamigahara Air and Space Museum in Japan, where sections of the original prototype and engines are displayed. These exhibits highlight the Kikka's role as a technological curiosity rather than as an operational weapon. Unlike the Me-262 or the Gloucester Meteor, which are preserved as icons of early jet combat, the Kikka remains obscure to the general public. Doctrinally, the Kikka's development reinforced the lesson that advanced technology alone cannot reverse the course of war without the industrial capacity to produce and sustain it. Japan's inability to mass-produce the aircraft, train pilots, and secure fuel supplies ensured that the Kikka could never be more than an experimental gesture. For later generations of Japanese engineers, this lesson informed a post-war emphasis on realistic production goals and incremental innovation, rather than reliance on miracle weapons. In the broader history of aviation, the Kikka is remembered as one of several late-war jet projects undertaken by nations on the brink of defeat, alongside the German Heinkel, He-162, and Italian Caproni Campini designs that illustrated both the promise and the limitations of jet technology in 1945. It did not influence the outcome of the war, nor did it shape the jet age that followed. Instead, its legacy is that of a historical marker, Japan's entry into the jet era, arriving too late to matter militarily but significant enough to stand as a testament to ingenuity under impossible circumstances. The Kikka remains a footnote in global aviation, but within that footnote lies a powerful story. It was not a weapon that changed history, but it was a symbol of how far nations would go to seek technological salvation in moments of crisis. Its ultimate impact lies in its lesson that technology without time, resources, and strategic coherence cannot alter the tide of war. The Nakajima Kikka's unseen chapters and forgotten missions reside largely in the realm of proposals, aborted developments, and post-war evaluations rather than in operational records. Because the aircraft never advanced beyond a prototype, much of its story lies in what might have been rather than what was. These fragments offer a deeper understanding of how Japan hoped to use the Kikka and how the Allies interpreted its significance after the war. Among the more striking but little-known ideas was the proposal to launch Kikka units from converted ships or submarines. Some Navy planners imagined equipping vessels with catapults or rocket-assisted launch rails that would allow Kikkas to be deployed at sea. These aircraft, configured as suicide bombers with heavy warheads, could theoretically have been launched from hidden positions to attack Allied invasion fleets. The plan was born from the same thinking that produced submarine-borne seaplanes earlier in the war, but it was wildly impractical given Japan's dwindling naval resources. Still, the fact that it was considered shows how flexible the Navy wanted the Kikka to be. Another forgotten element is the degree to which the Kikka was tied to the kamikaze strategy. While historians often emphasize its potential as a strike or reconnaissance aircraft, many surviving documents suggest that one-way missions were seen as its most realistic use. By stripping away landing gear and non-essential systems, the aircraft could carry a larger bomb load and rely on rocket boosters to get airborne. This reflects Japan's strategic mindset in 1945. Conventional victory was no longer the goal, only the infliction of maximum damage during the defense of the home islands. Post-war, the Allies studied the Kikka carefully, not because it posed a major threat, but because it revealed the extent of Japan's efforts to replicate and adapt German technology. U.S. forces captured incomplete airframes and several Ne-20 engines, transporting them to the United States for evaluation. Reports concluded that while the Kikka borrowed heavily from the Me-262's general layout, it was in fact an independent design, simplified to suit Japanese production capacity. Engineers noted the compromises in metallurgy and engine performance, concluding that even if produced, the aircraft would have been outclassed by Allied jets then in development. Nonetheless, these evaluations preserved technical details that might otherwise have been lost. Another overlooked chapter is the role the Kikka played in preserving Japanese aeronautical expertise after the war. Many of the engineers who had worked on the project later transitioned into civilian aerospace development under Allied supervision. Their experience with turbojet engines, even at a rudimentary level, provided a foundation for Japan's re-entry into aviation in the 1950s. In this sense, the Kikka was a bridge, not to victory in war, but to post-war technical continuity. There are also the personal recollections of those who worked on the prototype and flight tests. Surviving testimonies from engineers and pilots describe the immense pressure to deliver results in a collapsing nation, and the sense of achievement when the aircraft first flew successfully. For them, the Kikka was proof that Japan could still innovate despite overwhelming adversity. These voices, though rarely highlighted, add a human dimension to the project, illustrating the mix of desperation and pride that surrounded the effort. Finally, the Kikka's absence from public memory is itself a kind of forgotten story. Unlike the German jets that inspired it, no intact Kikka survives, and it has never been restored as a flying exhibit. Only fragments and replicas remain, scattered across museums. This lack of physical preservation has contributed to its obscurity, leaving it overshadowed by the more famous jets of the era. Yet in the margins of history, the Kikka endures as a symbol of Japan's late-war gamble on technology. A gamble that came too late, with too few resources, but that nonetheless left its mark on the story of aviation. In these unseen chapters, plans for naval deployment, kamikaze variants, Allied evaluations, and the continuity of Japanese engineering expertise, the Kikka emerges as more than just a failed prototype. It was a last attempt to harness technology in the face of certain defeat, and a reminder of how even unfinished projects can shape narratives of innovation, desperation, and survival. The Nakajima Kikka's final chapter is one of symbolism rather than combat record. It never became the operational weapon its designers envisioned, nor did it influence the outcome of the war in any measurable way. Yet as Japan's first jet-powered aircraft, it marked the nation's entry into a new era of aviation, even if that entry came at the very moment when defeat rendered it irrelevant. The Kikka's abrupt end was dictated by timing. Its first flight in August 1945 coincided with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and within days, Japan had surrendered. What might have been the beginning of a new generation of aircraft instead became a technological dead end. Only one prototype flew, another sat incomplete on the production line, and a handful of components awaited assembly. None were ever finished, and all were soon captured or dismantled by Allied forces. The aircraft that was supposed to defend the home islands never had the chance to leave the test field. In assessing the Kikka's place in history, it is clear that it was less a revolutionary leap than a pragmatic adaptation. While inspired by the German Me-262, it was not a copy. Japanese engineers simplified the design, scaled it down, and tailored it to their industrial limitations. The result was an aircraft that, while modest compared to European jets, demonstrated ingenuity in the face of scarcity. Its folding wings, rocket-assisted takeoff capability, and multi-role potential reflected careful adaptation to Japan's defensive needs. But these qualities were never tested in combat, and they remained speculative rather than proven. The Allies, upon examining the captured prototypes, recognized both the achievement and the shortcomings. American engineers noted that the NE-20 engines were underpowered and unreliable. The airframe lacked the refinement of German jets, and production feasibility was doubtful. Yet they also acknowledged that the Kikka had flown successfully, a feat in itself given the conditions of Japan in 1945. To historians, this paradox defines the Kikka, an advanced concept created in a nation with no realistic capacity to support it. The Kikka's legacy lies partly in what followed after the war. For the Japanese engineers who had worked on the project, the experience with jet propulsion proved invaluable when the country's aviation industry was reborn in the 1950s. Although military aircraft production was banned for several years, expertise gained through the Kikka program carried over into civilian projects and later into Japan's re-entry into aerospace technology. In this way, the aircraft's value was not in the battles it never fought, but in the continuity of knowledge it preserved. Culturally, the Kikka stands as a symbol of desperation and ambition. It embodies Japan's attempt to match its adversaries technologically even as its empire crumbled. Its maiden flight, so close to the end, was not the start of a new phase in the war, but a final gesture of resistance. That symbolism has endured in the historical narrative. The Kikka is remembered not for victories, but for what it represented about the final months of Japan's struggle. Today, only fragments and replicas survive. The absence of a complete preserved aircraft reinforces its ghostly presence in aviation history. Unlike the Mi-262 or Gloucester Meteor, which became icons of the jet age, the Kikka exists largely as a footnote, Japan's first jet, but also its last gamble. Exhibits in museums keep its memory alive, but for most it remains obscure, overshadowed by more successful designs. In conclusion, the Nakajima Kikka's story is one of promise overtaken by reality. It demonstrated that Japan could build and fly a jet aircraft under extraordinary pressure, but it came too late to matter. Its technical compromises, resource limitations, and the collapse of the empire ensured that it would never progress beyond prototype form. Its significance is therefore symbolic, a testament to ingenuity under impossible circumstances, and a reminder of the limits of technology when time and resources are gone. The Kikka remains a striking example of a nation's gamble on innovation in the face of inevitable defeat. A jet that flew but never truly entered the war it was built to fight. The Nakajima Kikka's place in aviation history is best understood as both a technical milestone and a strategic footnote. As Japan's first jet aircraft, it proved that even under extreme duress, its engineers could achieve a level of innovation that paralleled developments in Europe. But because it never entered service, its impact was symbolic rather than practical. This paradox of success in design but failure in deployment defines its legacy. In technical terms, the Kikka represented a genuine leap forward for Japanese aviation. Its NE-20 turbojet engines, though underpowered, were a breakthrough for an industry that had never before produced a functional jet power plant. The aircraft's compact layout, folding wings, and adaptability for rocket-assisted takeoff illustrated creative responses to Japan's defensive situation. These design decisions, tailored to dispersed operations and short runways, revealed a practical awareness of the conditions of 1945, when conventional bases were increasingly vulnerable to American attack. Compared to piston engine contemporaries still in use, the Kikka was a modern step, proof that Japan was attempting to close a technological gap. Strategically, however, the aircraft was too little and far too late. Even if the Kikka had entered limited production, its underpowered engines and modest performance meant it could not have matched the Allied P-80 Shooting Star or Gloucester Meteor. Against the P-51 Mustang, it might have been competitive in speed under ideal conditions, but reliability issues would have severely hampered combat operations. At best, the Kikka could have harassed invasion fleets or conducted one-way strikes, imposing some disruption without altering the trajectory of the war. By August 1945, Japan lacked the resources, fuel, and trained pilots to sustain meaningful jet operations, ensuring the aircraft could never fulfill the hopes placed on it. The Allies regarded the Kikka as an interesting curiosity rather than a game-changing weapon. Captured airframes and engines were shipped to the United States, where engineers studied them alongside German jets. Reports noted the evident influence of the Mi-262 but concluded that the Kikka was an independent effort, scaled down and simplified to suit Japan's limited industrial base. American analysts recognized the ingenuity involved but saw little that could inform their own rapidly advancing jet programs. The P-80 and later designs were already years ahead, and the Kikka became more of a historical artifact than a technical inspiration. Post-war, the Kikka's influence lingered indirectly through the engineers who built it. Their experience with turbojets and advanced airframes became the foundation of Japan's post-war aviation revival in the 1950s, when restrictions on aircraft production were lifted. Civilian designs like the YS-11 airliner benefited from this preserved expertise, while Japan's eventual re-entry into military aviation also drew upon the knowledge base created during projects such as the Kikka. Thus, the aircraft contributed not through combat but through continuity of technical skill. The absence of surviving complete airframes has deepened the Kikka's obscurity. Unlike the Mi-262 or Meteor, which can be seen in museums and air shows, the Kikka exists today only as fragments and replicas. Its story is largely confined to specialist histories, with little recognition among the wider public. This lack of tangible presence has made it one of the forgotten jets of the Second World War, overshadowed by its German and Allied counterparts. And yet, the Kikka holds a unique place as a symbol of Japan's technological gamble. It illustrates the tension between ambition and reality, a nation trying to leap into the jet age while lacking the industrial base to sustain it. It also underscores a broader lesson of warfare, that innovation without resources and time to implement it cannot change outcomes. The Kikka's importance lies not in victories or missions, but in the fact that it flew at all, proving what could be achieved under the most extreme conditions. In summary, the Nakajima Kikka remains a reminder of both achievement and futility. It was a milestone in Japanese aviation, yet a footnote in global history. A jet that flew only twice, built in an era when Japan's defeat was already sealed, it stands today as an emblem of a last, desperate attempt to match the pace of technological change. Its story is not one of triumph on the battlefield, but of innovation overtaken by the collapse of an empire. The Nakajima Kikka's conclusion as a historical subject rests on the duality of what it was and what it was not. It was Japan's first jet-powered aircraft, a remarkable achievement for a nation under siege, but it was also a project that never transcended its prototype stage, leaving no combat record and exerting little influence on post-war aviation. Its story is therefore defined by timing, conceived too late, tested too briefly, and remembered largely as a symbol of ambition in the face of inevitable defeat. In its final analysis, the Kikka epitomizes the desperate innovations of late-war Japan. Unlike Germany's Mi-262, which reached combat in significant numbers, or Britain's Meteor, which flew operational sorties before war's end, the Kikka was still at the threshold of development when the conflict concluded. Its maiden flight, coming on 7 August 1945, was overshadowed by events of far greater consequence: the atomic bombing of Hiroshima the day before and Nagasaki 4 days later. The aircraft thus entered history not as a weapon of war, but as a technological curiosity, a last attempt to demonstrate relevance at a time when Japan's surrender was imminent. The design itself reflected both ingenuity and compromise. Folding wings, rocket-assisted takeoff provisions, and a compact structure tailored for concealment spoke to the defensive mindset of Japan in 1945, preparing for invasion and attritional warfare on home soil. At the same time, the underpowered NE-20 engines, limited production capacity, and shortages of critical materials revealed the severe industrial decline facing the country. In practical terms, the Kikka would have struggled even if built in numbers. It was not a miracle weapon, but a stopgap shaped by necessity. Its post-war significance lay more in continuity of expertise than in technological impact. Captured examples allowed the Allies to measure Japan's progress, but offered little that could not already be gleaned from German designs. For Japanese engineers, however, the Kikka preserved knowledge of jet propulsion and advanced airframe construction at a critical moment. After the war, when Japan re-established its aerospace industry in civilian form, many of the skills honed on the Kikka project were carried forward. The aircraft's legacy thus survived indirectly through the engineers who had struggled to bring it into existence. The absence of surviving complete examples has relegated the Kikka to obscurity. Unlike the Mi-262, Meteor, or P-80, which became icons of the early jet age, the Kikka is represented today only by replicas and fragments in museums. Its lack of physical preservation reinforces its role as a footnote rather than a chapter in aviation history. Yet this absence has also given it a symbolic power. As one of the great what-if machines of the Second World War, remembered not for its victories but for the timing of its arrival. In cultural and historical terms, the Kikka embodies the paradox of late-war innovation. It was a leap forward technically, proving that Japan could enter the jet age, but it was also an act of futility, arriving at the moment when technology could no longer compensate for overwhelming strategic realities. Its place in history is secured not by combat but by context, a jet that took to the skies even as the empire that built it collapsed beneath it. Ultimately, the Nakajima Kikka is remembered as Japan's jet gamble, a project born of desperation, shaped by ingenuity, and ended by surrender. It represents both the pinnacle of Japanese aviation in the Second World War and the limits of what technology can achieve without time, resources, or opportunity. In that contradiction lies its enduring fascination, an aircraft that flew only briefly, but that continues to serve as a stark reminder of the closing chapter of the piston era and the unrelenting dawn of the jet age.